pretty cool. I'm telling you, last week was a pretty cool week. And I asked our community pastor, Moose, who oversees Serve Sunday. I said, look, man, I'd like to get more information because I wasn't everywhere. I didn't get to see everything. And so I said, man, if you just gather some information and send it to me. So let me tell you about some of what Moose sent me. You saw on the video that we had 344 people participate. This is our third Serve Sunday, the third Serve Sunday that we've done, and that's the highest participation that we have had yet. So we set a record last week, which is really incredible. Also, you noticed on there that we had 24 projects that we did. I want to give you just a bit of a breakdown on what we actually did. 7 of those projects were where we partnered with and we served schools in our community. 7 of them were where we served family-oriented agencies. 2 of them are where we served homeless resource providers. 2 of them were where we went to nursing homes and we loved on people who sometimes, well, let's be honest, most of the time get overlooked. One of them was one of the projects we did was a first responder appreciation, which was really, really neat. Also, we served a special needs agency and we went to a disabled person's home and we did a home improvement project. So that's just kind of the quick breakdown of what we did last week. Also, some of those groups, let me just give you an idea what some of those groups did. There was one group that filled 207 bags full of food that our church has been collecting for the last several weeks. They put together 207 bags that are going to go to children, under-resourced children in our community who probably won't eat over the weekend. But this food is going to be given to that child when they go home on Friday. And because of our church and because of what we did last week, there are 207 kids. Wrap your mind around that for a second. 207 kids will go to bed with their bellies full because of what we did. Also, we replenished the food pantries in the Salvation Army and the River City Rescue Mission with food that, again, our church collected. And already there are 30 families in our community that have benefited and gained good from that. Also, last week there was a group of people who their project was to fill shoe boxes. And they filled those shoe boxes with all kinds of stuff. They put toys in there, they put shirts in there, they put shoes in there, soap, hand towels, toothbrushes, and all kinds of things like that. And they filled 150 of those. And what's going to happen to those boxes is, because it's a part of what we're doing as a church with Operation Christmas Child, is that those boxes are going to be sent all around the world to under-resourced kids who may never, ever be able to get those things that are in those boxes on their own. And as they're given that box, they're told about how God loves them and what Jesus did for them. Also, last week, there was a group that took 3 tons of crushed limestone, and in the span of about an hour, what they did was they fixed a driveway for a disabled person's home so that now she can move from her car into her home without getting hurt. Also, last week, there were a group of people from our church. They did a project where they put together diaper emergency kits. So they collected all kinds of things that you do when you change a diaper. They got diapers, they got wipes, and some other stuff, and they put them together in these kits. And then they went around to different restaurants and organizations in our community, and they simply said, hey, look, this is for an emergency. This is for that young family. They come in, life is frazzled, and then a diaper emergency happens. There's what my wife and I would have called a blowout. You get what I'm saying? Like, that's when stuff blows out. And it's normally everywhere. Look, when that happens, give them one of these things and tell them that God and Crossway Church love them. And I could keep going with story after story after story, but I wanted to tell you guys about that because I want you to know that I am so proud of you. I am so proud to be a part of this church family. I'm so proud to love and serve people in Vicksburg along with you guys. So keep up the great work. We are in our 5th and our final, well, actually maybe it's our 6th and our final week of a sermon series that we're doing entitled How to Neighbor. And the reason why we're doing this sermon series is because Jesus gave us 2 huge commandments. He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, And then he gave us another commandment. But as he communicated that second commandment, he communicated in such a way as so that you and I would understand that these two commandments, they're connected. You can't really do the first one without also doing the second one. So the second commandment he gave us was, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, in the conversation where Jesus gave these two commandments, he went on to say that all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. In other words, if you and I were to pick up our Bible and we start looking through it and we'd find the stuff that we understand and the stuff that we don't understand, the stuff we like and the stuff that we don't like, the stuff that's easy to do and the stuff that's hard to do, the stuff that comforts us and the stuff that discomforts us, if we were to take all of that and boil it down to just two things, it comes down to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And so we've been talking about that second command, love your neighbor as yourself. And the reason why we've been doing that is because when we get really honest, it can be tricky. Sometimes it's hard to know. Are we getting it right? Are we getting it wrong? Are we actually doing what Jesus intended when he said, love your neighbor as yourself? And so throughout the series, what we've been doing is we've been talking about different groups of people. Some of them are like us. Some of them are not like us. Some of them need help from us. But all of them are people that if Jesus were standing here today, he would say, them, those are the they. That's your neighbor. I want you to love them like you love. I'm going to get out of this cloud. I don't know what's going on. Low-lying clouds running through church. But Jesus would say, those folks, those are the ones that I want you to love like you love yourself. And so, in week 1, we talked about loving people of a different race. And then we talked about loving the lonely, and then we talked about loving the orphan, and then we talked about loving the poor. And today I want to talk about one final group of people that we have been called to love. They're our neighbors. And the group of people I want to talk about that we need to love are each other. How do we love people who are a part of our Crossway church family? Now, to be really, really clear, many of the things that we've already talked about in this series actually apply to how we love each other. But specifically, I want to talk about how we love each other by working for unity. Max Lucado tells this rather interesting story. He tells a story about some sailors that were out sailing in the sea one day, and at first everything was fine, and then all of a sudden a storm came out. They didn't know it was coming. It was a sudden thing. It was violent, and before they could even do anything about it, they found themselves, their boats overturned, and they were thrown into the sea. And they were doing their best to just survive and keep their head above water when they looked up and they could see the captain coming. The captain had a much larger vessel, and he was weaving his way through the wind and the waves and the wreckage, and he was saving sailor after sailor after sailor. Before they knew it, they found themselves deposited on an island, and they were listening to the captain's instructions. The captain said, look, here's the deal. There are more people at sea that need rescued. I'm going to go rescue some more people. I want you guys to stay here. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to build a fire. I want you to build a fire that is so big and so tall that everybody who wants to can be warmed by it. And I want the fire to be so big and so tall that it will act as a beacon for those who are lost at sea. I want them to see that light and experience hope. And then as soon as the captain had given his instructions, he turned around, he went back to his boat and began to rescue more people. And at first, the sailors were so grateful for what the captain had done, and they were so happy to be alive, that they eagerly went about the work that the captain gave them. They built a fire, a huge, huge fire. And then they waited. And they waited, and they waited, and they waited, and they waited. And the longer they waited, their mentality and their attitude went from gratitude for what the captain had done for them to irritation with one another. They're not really sure when the argument started, but everyone was abundantly clear that the argument had to do with the captain's instructions. The captain had told them to use trees and build the biggest fire they possibly could. But some people began to wonder, did the captain, did he mean only trees, or did he mean mostly trees? Some people argued adamantly, no, the captain said only trees. We can only use trees. Still, other people began to say, well, surely mostly trees works, right? Surely we can use some brush and some grass and some leaves, and we can mostly trees fire. And they began to discuss it, and then people formed opinions, and then they began to discuss it some more, and then debate broke out, and eventually dispute and arguments occurred. And before they knew it, there was division on the island. And instead of having one big, tall fire, they had two smaller fires. One that was the trees only, and one that was the mostly trees fire. And then peace returned to the island, but it was short-lived. Because in the trees only fire, a new discussion broke out. They began to debate and talk about, well, what kind of trees? When the captain was standing there, someone said, and he gave us his instructions, he gestured toward an elm tree. So surely he meant only elm trees. Someone else said, no, he was standing closest to cypress trees when he said that. Surely he meant cypress trees. And then another person chimed in and they said, well, the most predominant tree on the island are oak trees. Surely he meant oak trees. And they began to discuss it, and then people formed opinions, and then before long they're debating, and debate led to dispute and arguments, and all of a sudden more division took place. Instead of having a fairly large trees-only fire, they had smaller fires. There was an elm and a cypress and an oak only, 3 different fires. I'd like to tell you that things were going better on the other side of the island with the mostly trees crowd, but things weren't going better over there either. They weren't arguing about the contents of the fire. They were discussing how high exactly is high. The captain said, build a big, big fire, but what's big? What's big to some people is not big to other people, and they discussed it, and then people formed opinions, and then debate occurred. Debate led to dispute and arguments, and before you know it, the entire island was dotted with much, much smaller fires. The captain, who was out at sea rescuing people, he was watching this whole thing happen, and all he could do from his ship was just hang his head and sigh. It'd be a rather bizarre story if it wasn't so true. You don't really have to be a Christian very long or go to church very long or be a person of faith very long until you discover that on the island that is God's church, there seem to be a lot of little fires. We have this seemingly unhealthy propensity towards disunity. Now, in all fairness, we didn't start this. We're not the first ones to do it. The disciples, even before Jesus was crucified, spent a lot of time arguing about what was right and what was wrong and who was most important and who was least important. But regardless of when it started and regardless of how frequently we do it, disunity always has a cost. Disunity, for instance, it distracts the believer. Our captain Jesus Christ, gave us some very clear instructions. He said, look, the mission is this. I want you to build a fire, the largest fire that you possibly can. And I want it to be so big that anybody and everybody who wants to be warmed by it can be warmed by it. And I want it to be so big that those who are lost can see the light and find hope. But when you and I get focused on discussing and arguing and debating other things, the contents of the fire or the height of the fire, we get distracted. But also disunity, it doesn't just distract, it discourages the seeker. Because at the end of the day, who wants to come out of the storm in the sea to the fighting on the island? But disunity doesn't just do that, it also discredits our Savior. Because at the end of the day, unity was his idea. In fact, just before Jesus was crucified, he prayed in a garden, and here's what he prayed. My prayer is not for them, the them he's talking about there are the disciples. My prayer isn't just for my disciples alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, So Jesus is sitting here, he's praying, he's fervently praying, and he's like, God, I'm not just praying for my disciples, I'm praying for everybody down the road that will believe because of them. Translation, God, my prayer for Crossway Church. My prayer for my people who will gather on Highway 61 South. Here's my prayer for them, that all of them may be one. God, I'm praying that they will be unified. I'm praying that they will live in unity. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us. And here's why, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. God, I'm praying that Crossway Church will be one. Because when they're one, an unbelieving world will start to believe. What's interesting to me here is that what Jesus doesn't say. He doesn't say, Jesus, he doesn't say, God, if they could just have really nice facilities. God, if they could just have really good music. God, if they could just have really good outreach programs. And don't get me wrong, none of those things are bad. We should be pursuing them, okay? But Jesus is praying for our unity because it's our unity that convinces people of the reality and the message of Jesus Christ. I think perhaps one of the most important questions we will ever ask ourselves is this question right here. If the dispensers of love, and that's you and me, because we've been called to love our neighbor, if the dispensers of love can't find a way to love each other, how many people will be encouraged to seek what we have? You see, this is a high stakes issue. And I think Paul knew that because I think that's what he understood when in Romans chapter 14, he wrote to the Christians in Rome and he said this, let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace. He says, guys, let's do whatever it takes. Let's do whatever we have to do so that we can live in peace with each other. Let's do whatever we have to do so we can experience harmony with one another. Let's do whatever we have to do so that we are unified, so we work and act as one. Paul says, look, let's do whatever it takes. And the interesting thing for me is the word he uses in the Greek language. This phrase right here, make every effort, in the Greek language is actually a Greek verb it's in a tense that doesn't exist in our English language, so it's very difficult to translate. The idea of what Paul's trying to say when he says make every effort, he's trying to say, he says, make every effort, continue making every effort, never stop making efforts. You see, Paul wants us to be clear. Unity is not something we wish for and we get. It's not a one and done either. Ultimately, here's my summary of what Paul's trying to say. Unity is not the byproduct of chance or of a singular moment. When you and I think about unity, this thing that Jesus prayed that we would have, this thing that Jesus prayed that we pursue, it might be healthiest if you and I think about it in terms of a garden that needs continual tending. There are always weeds trying to grow in and choke out things that are healthy. So in Romans chapter 15, verse 7, Paul gives his prescription for disunity. And here's what he says, accept one another then just as Christ accepted you. Now to fully understand what Paul's trying to communicate here, it's important that you understand something about the context. For the past 33 verses, the previous 33 verses, Paul has been talking to the Romans about unity. And he's been pleading with them to be unified. He's been pleading for them and making his case for unity. And he starts his case and he starts his conversation in Romans chapter 14, verse 1. And in Romans chapter 14, verse 1, as he starts talking about unity, he uses the very same word that Paul uses here. He says, accept. So Paul uses it twice because he doesn't want us to miss it. And what he goes on to tell the Roman Christians is he goes, look, accept people into your group that are different than you are, and don't argue about opinions. That was the essence of his advice. Now, that was very important advice because there was a lot of arguing about opinions going on in the Roman church. The Roman church was comprised of two different categories of people. Each of them had their own histories, their own backgrounds, their own experiences, their own cultures, and everything else that went along with it. It was comprised of Jewish Christians and non-Jewish or Gentile Christians. And because they came from different places, they began to argue about at least two different things. They were arguing about meat that was offered to idols, and they were also arguing about special days that existed in the Jewish calendar. When it came to the meat, here's what would happen. In their community, there was meat that was offered to idols, and then afterwards it was sold to people. And the Gentiles were buying it and they were eating it. Well, the Jewish people, they came from a faith tradition, 2,000 years of teaching, where they were told, look, you run from any and everything that has to do with idolatry, and you run like the plague. And so these guys were telling these guys, look, you shouldn't do that. It's been offered to idols, and that's not good. We shouldn't do that. We worship God alone and all this sort of stuff. And these guys, these Gentile believers are going, I didn't offer it to an idol. I mean, I just got it on the for sale rack at the supermarket. I'm trying to feed my family. I'm not offering anything to idols. And they went back and forth and back and forth. And then people formed opinions, and opinion led to debate. Debate was leading to argument. They were well on their way to being divided. Also, there was the issue of days, holy days on the Jewish calendar. The Jewish Christians were raised their entire life, if you want to love God properly, if you want to honor him, that these days were central to their faith. And they were trying to get these Gentile believers to buy into it and to do it with them. And they're like, look, I like some of that. I don't like some of that. Can we make some tweaks? And, I want to participate, but I got this family thing. And they started going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And the interesting thing to me about Paul, the way that Paul handles this, is he doesn't come in and tell them, look, you're right and you're wrong. He doesn't resolve the issue for them. What he simply does is he says, accept one another. Accept one another, and don't argue about opinions. Now, as Paul says this, he acknowledges a very important reality that's a part of church family life. And the reality that he's acknowledging here is that there will be issues that are a matter of opinion and a matter of preference. Now, to be clear, there are some issues in church family life that are not. There's some issues in church family life that are a matter of truth and they are a matter of doctrine. For instance, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus is a matter of truth and it's a matter of doctrine. The deity of Jesus Christ is a matter of truth and it's a matter of doctrine. The Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity, that is a matter of truth, and doctrine. That is not a matter of opinion. When it comes to issues that are a matter of truth and a matter of doctrine, there is no room for opinions because it's truth, it's doctrine. But after that, there are a whole slew of things that are a matter of opinion and a matter of preference. And it's okay. It's okay to have it's okay to have an opinion, it's okay to have a preference. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Let me give you an example of something that might be a matter of preference or opinion. The music that we do in our service. That's a matter of opinion, and it's a matter of preference. Our mission strategy as a church, that's a matter of opinion, and it's a matter of preference. There's nothing wrong with having opinions and preferences. It's what we do with them, though, that really matters. And Paul says, look, accept one another. Now, when Paul says accept one another, he's not just saying that you and I, that we should agree to disagree and kind of go our separate ways and do our best to meet on Sunday morning and kind of just barely tolerate each other. When Paul says accept one another, he actually gives the word accept, really, it means to receive somebody into your heart. But Paul wanted us to be absolutely clear about what he meant by that, so he said accept one another just as you've been accepted by Jesus. So we're supposed to give what we have received. Jesus accepted us, so we accept each other. We disagree. We don't see eye to eye on some things that are opinions or preferences. But that doesn't mean we separate or we don't engage with each other. Normally, in fact, I would argue what Paul would say is that when you disagree, the correct way to go about it is to push into the relationship instead of away from it. Accept one another. Now, if we were to read Romans chapter 14, which I'm not going to do today, Paul essentially gives 3 imperatives about how you and I work for the unity that Jesus so desperately prayed for. And here are the 3 pieces of advice he gave us. And really, actually, they're not advice, they're instructions, they're commands. If we don't do this, we're sinning. Number 1, he said, don't argue. Don't argue about opinions and preferences. Now, we can have conversations. We can have discussions. We can share ideas. We can challenge each other's thinking. We can admonish each other. We can even debate if we do it in a God-honoring way. But the minute we find ourselves in a conversation where we disagree with somebody and our blood pressure begins to rise and so does our voice, then you have been called and commanded by God in that moment to just stop. One of the most loving things you may ever do if you find yourself in a moment like that is to stop and just walk away. Stop and just walk away. Because at the end of the day, it's better to lose an argument than it is a friend. It's better to lose an argument than it is for us as a church to lose the unity. It's just better. And by the way, if you ever find yourself in a moment where you're 2 other people that are part of our church family are doing that, and the things have gotten bad and it's out of control and it's unhealthy, what I'd like to do officially is deputize you to do something about it. Here's what I want to deputize you to do. I want to deputize you to stand between those two members of our church family and remind them, we don't argue about opinions or preferences. We don't do that. It's better to lose an argument than it is a friend or the unity that Jesus prayed that we would have. So Paul told them, look, don't argue. The second thing he told them was this. He said, stop judging one another. In fact, in verse 13, here's how he said it. Therefore, let us stop passing judgment on one another. I think it's important that we define what passing judgment is. Passing judgment is where we go from dealing with an issue to attacking a person. Passing judgment is when you and I look at something that somebody said or something somebody did, and we start making or drawing conclusions about their intentions and their motives. It's when you and I look at somebody and we see something they did, and we start to go, oh, well, they did that because they're just trying to be difficult, or they did that because they don't like me, or they did that because they're a bad person. They did that because they don't believe, they don't believe in me, they don't, all this sort of stuff. Paul says, look, stop passing judgment. And thirdly, here's the advice that he gave. Do what makes peace. Do what makes peace. Before we attack people, we need to talk to them. Please don't miss that. Before we attack people, we need to talk to them. There was somebody that did this with me this past week. They didn't like a decision that I was a part of making. And so they didn't attack me, they just came and we had a conversation. But here's what I want you to know. If I have a problem with Gary, and I hope there aren't any Garys in here. If you're here and you're Gary, I don't have a problem with you. It's just an example. But if I have a problem with Gary, it's my responsibility to go to Gary and talk to Gary about my problem with Gary. I shouldn't go to Dan to talk to him about my problem with Gary. That's called gossip. And gossip, no matter what the justification, no matter how minor we think or feel that it is, always dismantles unity. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there aren't moments where you find yourself in a situation and you have to seek outside counsel to try to figure out what to do. Those situations do exist, but let's be really honest. Most of the time that we participate in gossip, we're just spewing venom. We're not really trying to get help. And by the way, if you need a definition for gossip, here's what it is. Talking to somebody about the problem who cannot be a part of the solution to the problem. So if they can't be a part of solving it, you have just gossiped. And gossip is sin, and you need to know that. But before we attack people, we need to talk to them. And when we do, because this is part of the work of creating peace and doing what makes peace, and when we do talk to them, there's some important questions we need to ask ourselves. Like, is the thing that I'm about to say, is the thought that I'm about to express, the way I'm about to express it, does it make peace or not? This thought that I want to express, the way that I want to express this thought, will it help or will it hurt? And if the answer is it will create peace and it will help, we should go forward. And if it won't create peace and it will be hurtful, then we're called by God to shut our mouths and keep it to ourselves. This is how we make peace. Not every thought, not every feeling, not every idea that we all have should be expressed. And the reason why this is so important, again, is because if we can't be unified, if we allow small fires to start and we somehow lose the capacity to build a big fire, the largest one we possibly can, so that everybody around it who comes can be warmed, and it'll act as a beacon for those who are still lost. If we can't maintain unity, we dismantle our capacity to fulfill the vision and the mission that God has given us. So in the words of Paul, here's how we love one another. Make every effort to do what creates peace.